Hello and welcome to this video on inflation and controlling inflation. So inflation is an increase in the average price level in an economy over time. And if we're going to talk about prices in this video, it's worth thinking about what a price is. A price is a value that settles a transaction between a buyer and a seller in a marketplace. Buyers, consumers, provide demand for products and services, and sellers or firms provide the supply of goods and services. And the price is at which point that transaction takes place. So in this video, we're going to look at what factors influence the rate of price change in an economy or inflation. There are two types we need to be able to illustrate: demand pull and cost push, and then we're going to look at how inflation is controlled. Let's start off. There are three factors that influence the rate of inflation in an economy. One is demand, two is supply, and three is the amount of money. Let's start off with some demand side factors that will influence the rate of inflation. What sort of things will influence consumers within our economy and how much they demand goods and services? These might be some ideas. The level of their income, how much tax they have to pay and therefore how much income they have left over after tax, how wealthy they feel, which is normally determined by or often determined by house prices, often people's main asset, how the changes in fashions or tastes, or the availability of other products, substitute products. These might all affect the demand for a particular good or service and the overall level of demand in the economy, and therefore the rate at which prices might rise. In terms of supply side factors, these are things that would influence firms or the suppliers, sellers of goods and services in our economy. What might affect the price at which they're willing to sell? Well, these might be some ideas. Things like the cost of resources that they're using, the cost of finance, so for example paying back interest on loans, the technology available and how efficient that is, and then again the level of tax they're being charged by the government. All these might affect the price at which they're willing to sell and therefore the rate of inflation in our economy. The last one is the amount of money in the economy. Let's look at a little example here. What would be the impact on the price of goods and services if we increased the amount of money in the economy? Let's take a very simple example. Let's imagine this represents the amount of money in our economy, say £1,000, and our economy produces 1,000 products. If there's £1,000 in our economy being spent on 1,000 products, what would you say would be the average price? Well, you might reasonably say the average price should be about £1 a product. Now let's imagine the government print or create more money within the economy. So we have this scenario. We now have 3 bags of money, £3,000 in our economy, but still the same amount of products being produced. If we had £3,000 worth of money in the economy being spent on 1,000 products, what do we think would be the average price of a product? And if you said £3 per product, you'd probably be about right. So here the increase in money supply would change our products from £1 per product to £3 per product. So the moral of the story is the growth of the money supply will often cause inflationary pressures in an economy. Individuals and firms may spend the excess money on goods and services, driving up demand and raising the rate of inflation. If you don't believe me, you can check out this chart here. Along the x-axis, we have the percentage change in money supply from year to year for a country, and on the y-axis, we have the percentage change in the price level, CPI, within a country from year to year. And generally speaking, you can see that countries with higher rates of increase in the money supply correlate with higher rates of inflation. Simples. Okay, so we've looked at the factors that influence inflation. We're now going to look at two types, demand pull and cost push, before looking at how inflation is controlled. Let's start off with cost push inflation. Cost push inflation is where we have prices rising in our economy, and that's occurring because firms are responding to rising costs. So they're increasing the price at which they're willing to sell a certain amount of products to protect their profit margins. This might be caused by rising labour costs, maybe higher prices for raw materials, maybe there's a change in the exchange rate causing their import costs to be higher, or maybe it's been a change in tax from the government. Now we need to be able to illustrate this type of inflation using what's known as an ADS diagram. And this is how we would illustrate it. We are showing here a little model of our economy. On this axis, we have the price level in our economy. And on the x-axis down here, we have the level of real GDP, how much or the value of what's being produced in our economy. And we have a line here that represents the level of demand and a line here that represents the level of supply. So this line here shows us how much people are willing to buy at a given price level. And generally speaking, as the price level rises, people are willing or able to buy less. This line here shows us across the economy on aggregates how much firms are willing to supply. As the price level rises, as things become more expensive, they're willing to supply more, presumably because they make greater profit margins. Now, if there is an increase in costs to businesses, that would suddenly change their willingness to supply at a particular price. It would actually increase the cost of supply, and so in doing so would raise the price level in the economy from this position to this position, price level 1 to price level 2. So we would use this diagram to illustrate cost push inflation. The other source of inflation that we need to be able to illustrate is called demand pull inflation. And this occurs when there is an increase in AD. So where there is excess demand within our economy. And we would illustrate that using this diagram. Again, we have the price level in our economy on this axis. We have the level of output, real GDP, along the x-axis. We have the level of demand within our economy and the level of supply within our economy. And where demand meets supply, that is our equilibrium point. That is the current price level and the current level of output. If we see an increase in demand within our economy, that would increase demand and drive up the price level to price level 2, a higher price level. This would be inflation. So we can illustrate cost push inflation and demand pull inflation. Let's move on now and look at how inflation is controlled in the UK. Well, in the UK, the government have set an inflation target of 2%. They have given the Bank of England the responsibility to ensure that this rate is met. And the Bank of England can achieve this because they have the unique position in the economy of being able to change interest rates, the cost of borrowing. And the Bank of England is the picture in the background. In the Eurozone, those countries that use the euro, the process is very similar. The inflation target is close to but below 2%, and this is measured by harmonizing, combining consumer price indices from across the countries that use the euro. It is the responsibility of the ECB, the European Central Bank, for this rate, for this target to be met. And again, they achieve this by adjusting interest rates, the cost of borrowing. So we're going to follow this story through focusing on the Bank of England and the UK, but the same applies here when we're talking about Europe and the European Central Bank. So let's start off by looking at what interest rates are. So the Bank of England can control interest rates. An interest rate is either the cost of borrowing or the reward for saving, and it's normally given up as a percentage. So if you have £1,000 in your saving account and you have a 10% rate of interest, that means as a reward for you giving your money to the bank, at the end of the year they will give you 10% extra on top, which will take you up to £1,100. The flip side is if you are a borrower, so perhaps you have a mortgage because you've bought a house, then the percentage again that applies on what you've borrowed you have to pay back on top is known as the interest rate. And as we say, the Bank of England has a unique position because they can influence these rates. And this is the rate they're currently setting. So they have a record low rate at the moment of 0.25% as of August 2016. It's been low for quite a long time, but you can see back in time, it used to be a lot higher, the rate of interest that you would get in your savings or if you'd borrowed money. So how does the the Bank of England do this? What mechanisms do they use? Well, at the moment, we've seen that interest rates are quite low. They've fallen quite low. So what are they trying to achieve through this? Well, if interest rates are low, the cost of loan repayments is reduced. If your parents perhaps have a mortgage, they would see that they have lower mortgage repayments if interest rates are lower. Well, what's the effect of that, paying back less on your debts? Well, it might make you more confident to consume, and your disposable income, how much income you have to spend freely on goods and services, might rise. So we might well see increased spending by customers or consumers. Businesses also should be boosted because A, they can see the prospect of rising demand from consumers, and B, if they borrow money, their loan repayments would be reduced as well. So more spending and more investment should lead to more demand in the economy, which should help prices rise. So the Bank of England will lower interest rates if they want more demand and prices to rise to get closer to their 2% target of inflation. What happens if inflation rises too much, goes way above 2%? Well, in that situation, they might raise interest rates. Let's look what happens when the Bank of England raise interest rates. If they raise interest rates, it makes the cost of borrowing more expensive, which means there'll be higher mortgage payments, so reducing household disposable income, also higher repayments on other things like credit cards and personal loans. This means there might be less lending or less borrowing, less spending and less investment. Less spending and investment means less demand in our economy, and therefore prices should rise slower or possibly even go down. So it should lower inflation or maybe move to deflation. So a general rule here for the Bank of England is that if they raise interest rates, this should slow down the rate of inflation. If they cut interest rates, this should lead to faster inflation. And they can use this mechanism to control the rate of inflation in the economy. So in this video, we have looked at factors that influence inflation, demand, supply, and money. We've looked at illustrating demand pull and cost push inflation. And then we've done a brief introduction into how inflation is controlled in the UK. See you later.